Good evening, everybody. I'm going to stand at the podium. This will be the last time I think you see anybody at the podium today. We're going to keep this quite informal. I think we're going to have a slide presentation, and Mother Vaishnav may be wandering around a little bit for that. I'm Marshall Bhutan. I'm acting director of CASI. I'm delighted to welcome you all to CASI's discussion on the 2019 Indian national elections. We thank you all for attending, and I know you will be rewarded for your attendance. So I'm fond of saying that every time India holds a national general election, it's the largest organized human activity, single organized human activity ever to have occurred on the planet. And every time India holds another one, it's, again, the largest single organized human activity ever to take place on the planet. That is the scale, and then the importance of what is about to happen just a week from tomorrow with the start of polling. And I might add that this election and future ones, as well as past ones, are dedicated to the exercise of democratic rights, and therefore something we might especially appreciate at this time in world affairs. Now, this election is no different. This year we will see approximately 900 million people exercise their franchise. And by the way, no hanging chads. It's a lengthy process, 7 weeks, because the Election Commission staff have to get around to every corner of the country, and they do so in a progressive fashion, but largely free of violence, certainly interference, and very rapidly calculated at the end. So the election of 2014 once again showed us that the Indian voter is very capable of surprising all of us, no matter how much we think we know about the Indian political process. And none of us, of course, knows, including my esteemed colleagues here, have a clue what the result will be. We have some ideas, but they're just our ideas. However, the stakes, of course, are very high. Certainly for Prime Minister Modi, whether or not he wins, his party wins re-election as the majority party in the parliament, or otherwise is able to form a government, on that will hinge his place in Indian history, ultimately. For the Congress Party and the Gandhi dynasty that has led it for well over a century, the result may very well be either a reaffirmation of the party and the family's leadership, or a resounding and perhaps final refutation of that leadership. Now, more importantly for the Indian nation, the result will greatly influence the trajectory of change in what will soon be, we think by 2024, 2025, the most populous nation in the world. Now, to comment on these and the many other issues that the election will entail has entailed and will continue to entail until we know the result, we are very fortunate to be able to bring to you a panel of 3 younger scholars, already known, however, despite their young age, and to me they're youthful, all of them, for their important contributions. Frankly, it's a great relief to someone like me to see scholars of their generation rise to the fore in commentary on India in our country. Now, Milan Vaishnav and Tanvi Madhan and Nilan Sarkar are prominent examples of this new generation of scholars, India specialists who will help us understand this vast and momentous economic and social transformation that India is going through. It's a speeding train that those 900 million people who are voting get on. They're already on it. We can't even take a measure of what it's going to mean for the future and for the United States and the world. Their brief bios are on your chairs, so I'm not going to say anything more about their backgrounds. Here's how we'll proceed. First, Milan will present a slide presentation that has really come out of the conversations among the three of them and represents many of the points that they would like to make. Separately, after Milan's finished, I will turn to each speaker with a question to sort of follow up on that presentation. And then finally, I'm going to take the privilege of the chair to ask them a couple of very difficult questions. And then we'll open the discussion to all of you, and we're planning to have as much of that time available to you as possible. So let me turn now to Milan Krishna.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? I think it's stuck on thanks very much for that introduction, Marshall. It's great to be back at CASI, a place that I've been fortunate enough to have worked closely with for the last many years. Marshall kind of told you already the dirty little secret, which is none of us actually know what's going to happen. So you're probably wondering, why are you bothering to come to this event? But we'll hopefully leave you with something like a sense of scenarios or a set of probabilities anyway. So Marshall already kind of covered this, but this is the greatest show on earth. An expected 900 million people eligible to vote. Last time in 2014, 66.5% of the electorate actually came out to vote. The number that I always find stunning is the number of first-time voters. So there are 130 million first-time voters. These are people between the ages of 18 and 23 who have never voted in a national election before. Just to put that in context, that's the population of Japan, Mexico, and roughly the same number of people who voted in our American 2016 presidential election, right? And that's just the first-time voters, right? So this is a fairly big deal. What I thought I would do in about 15 or 20 minutes is try to cover three things. The first thing is why the narrative on this election has shifted over the past 1 year to 18 months from what we thought was going to be a cakewalk for Mr. Modi and the BJP to a much more contested battle. The familiar trope of any Indian election is trying to discern the hava, right? The momentum, which way the mythical winds are blowing. And I would submit that the hava has actually shifted in the last couple of months, and we can talk about that. And then I'll end with a few election scenarios, three in particular, and try to give you a sense of what I think, anyway, the probabilities are. And Tanvi and Nilanjan may disagree, and you may disagree, so we'll look forward to that conversation. All right, so let me just start from the beginning. How did this turn from a cakewalk to a contest? So remember in 2017, the BJP just won a 3/4 majority in Uttar Pradesh, right? And the opposition was openly fretting about their chances in 2019. So Omar Abdullah, leading opposition figure in Jammu and Kashmir, said, let's just forget about 2019. Let's throw in the towel, start planning for 2024, because there's no way that we can kind of stop this Modi, Amit Shah, BJP juggernaut, right? So this was March 2017. Now here we are, thinking things look very differently, right? So in 2018, in December, there were three big state elections in the Hindi belt, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, all three of which were controlled by the BJP, that the Congress, under Rahul Gandhi, wrested back. And these three states are important because these are three states, also in the Lok Sabha election in 2014, the BJP swept, won almost every single seat in these three states that was up for offer. So there was a sense that now the Congress had a new kind of wind in their sails, and then all of a sudden the BJP, not the Congress, was on the ropes. Now, why did sentiment seem to have changed? Why do we think it might have changed? So one is, this idea that we're back to of it's the economy stupid, right? So when Narendra Modi was campaigning in 2013, 2014 to be the next prime minister, his promise was pretty simple, right? I have governed the state of Gujarat for 12 years. It has been under my tenure the fastest growing state in the union. If you elect me as prime minister, I will make all of India look like Gujarat, right? That was essentially, if you had to put it on a bumper sticker or in a nutshell, what he was promising. Now, if you look at his growth record, it's been very mixed. So this is quarterly GDP growth from June 2012 to December 2018. This red bar is when Modi came to power, right? Summer of 2014. And you can see here that there's not a linear story, right, of just growth kind of ever increasing. There's a lot of peaks and valleys. Growth really fell in 2017 on the heels of demonetization and GST, which came at some cost to growth. So not a clear victory for Narendra Modi on growth. When a national survey was done by CSDS in 2018 in May, they asked respondents, do you think Modi has succeeded in bringing in Achhe Din, right? Good times for the Indian economy. What's interesting there is that the mood seems to have shifted. In 2018 of May, over 50% of respondents say Modi has failed to bring in Achhe Din, right? And a much smaller percentage of people believe that he succeeded in doing so. So this lofty promise of 2013-14 doesn't seem to have materialized. Now, what's a particular focus right now is what's happening in the rural economy. There is what we call, quote-unquote, agrarian distress happening for a number of reasons. Farm prices are an 18-year low. We've seen rural wages totally stagnant. And when 50% of your labor force is indirectly or directly employed by agriculture, right, this is not just a big economic problem, it's a big political problem. Now, what this shows you is the trend in food inflation. Now, remember, during the UPA government, inflation was in the double digits. This was seen as a major liability for the government, and now inflation is low, which you would think would be a good thing, but the trouble is, while low inflation has been very good for urban consumers, it hasn't been very good for rural producers, right? And so now they're feeling the effects of this, despite the fact that the Modi government's actually done quite a lot on building rural assets. So roads, toilets, electricity connections, all of those things have actually increased, but incomes have not, right? The second thing that has changed is this idea of anti-incumbency. So in 2014, the BJP got 75% of their parliamentary tally from just 8 states, right? And these are the 8 states of the sort of traditional kind of Hindi heartland of north central India. Now, we know 2 things. One is that, statistically speaking, incumbents in India actually are at a disadvantage. So unlike the United States, where there's an incumbency advantage, you are more likely to lose your seat if you're an incumbent than if you're the challenger in India, right? So they actually hold, office holders suffer a kind of penalty. And number 2 is, in December 2018, 3 states of those 8 states were taken away by the Congress. So if we believe that what happened in December is likely to be replicated at the national level, in these 3 states, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, the BJP would lose 27 of its 282 seats right there. Now, this is assuming a very simple 100% identical performance in the assembly and national elections, which we could debate because there's differences between state and national elections. But this is just sort of one kind of projection, and then based on this, you can extrapolate what might happen in other northern Hindi Belt states. The third thing which has changed is opposition coordination. Now remember, in 2014, the opposition felt that each one of them could take the BJP on their own, and they failed, right? The BJP ran roughshod over them. This time, they are trying to work together in what I would call kind of opportunistic kind of marriages of convenience, right? So these are not coalitions brought about by any sense of common ideology, common leadership, common beliefs. It's simply a way to prevent the BJP from winning again, right? So these are opportunistic state-level coalitions to keep the BJP at bay. We've seen the 2 biggest regional parties in Uttar Pradesh, the SP and the BSP, come together for this purpose. We saw in the state of Karnataka, which had elections last year, that the Congress and a regional party, the JDS, who fought elections separately, came together after the election with the express purpose of keeping the BJP out. Okay, so that's a little bit about why we think the narrative has changed. So now the question is, which way is the Hava going today as we speak in early April? One thing to note is that even before the recent tensions between India and Pakistan, the BJP coalition was poised to do well. So this is an average of opinion surveys done across the country. I'm sorry for the labeling, which has gotten totally screwed up, but this should read 12/31/2018. And what it shows you is that, yes, the NDA expected seats has come down quite considerably from, this would have been in 2017. But even if you just take the average of the surveys, the NDA would get around 250 seats. Remember, you need 272 to form a parliamentary majority. So at 250 seats, you're not that far off, right? Most analysts believe that BJP could get enough regional parties to put them over the edge to form the government, right? So despite the narrowing and the change in the narrative, there was still arguably some distance between the two major alliances. Okay, what else has happened? Well, one argument is that the Congress may have taken away the wrong lesson from the December 2018 state elections. If you look at the actual results, this is the vote share of the BJP in the Congress in those Hindi belt states, leaving aside Chhattisgarh, which was much more one-sided. This was essentially a tie ball game, right? The vote share of the BJP in the Congress in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan was almost identical. So votes shift just a little bit more the other way, and we could have seen BJP governments in two of these three states. But the message the Congress has taken away is that there's a new pro-Congress momentum throughout the country that we're benefiting from. And this has informed the way in which they've tried to negotiate with their potential coalition allies to say, look, we now have some momentum, so as we're thinking about seat sharing agreements, you need to give us more seats because we are on the upswing and the BJP's on the downswing. The regional allies have balked at some of what the Congress has been demanding, which has led to all kinds of issues in sorting out various alliance arrangements. The second thing is that the BJP has not just stood still while the narrative has been shifting. They have tried to use policy to counteract the narrative. So what have they done? So the first thing is they introduced this new reservation for 10% quotas in educational seats in civil service posts for the economically weaker sections of the general caste category. So basically, people who are not already getting reservations, Dalits, tribals, and OBCs, everyone else, the 10% of the economically weakest members of that group are going to get this reservation. So that was a new innovation they brought about. They got the Constitution amended to make this happen. In the budget in February, they introduced a number of kind of feel-good, kind of pro-middle class, sort of tax policies. And then the newest thing they've rolled out is an unconditional income support scheme for farmers, right? So there's been a lot of talk in India about a universal basic income to make sure that everyone has a kind of floor in terms of the income they get. They haven't done that. What they've done is, for small farmers who own no more than 2 hectares of land, we are going to give you an annual payment, no questions asked, of 6,000 rupees. What you do with that 6,000 rupees is up to you. If you want to spend it on the family farm for fertilizer, you could do that. If you want to spend it on your kids' education, you could do that. If you just want to use it for a consumption expenditure, that's fine too. And they've managed to roll this out across the country just before elections. And so this is something they think will introduce, alleviate some of that rural distress that I mentioned earlier. The other thing on coalitions I just want to mention is it's not as if it's only the Congress which has been out there trying to stitch together the coalitions. Narendra Modi and Amit Shah actually have methodically been seeking coalition arrangements of their own. So just in the past few weeks, they've announced alliances in Bihar, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, throughout the Northeast. In some cases, giving more seats to their partners than they probably deserve on the basis of how they performed in 2014, but as a goodwill gesture to say, look, we want to bring you all aboard. The Congress has been relatively slow and has kept some of its alliance partners waiting, or potential alliance partners, partially for the reason that I mentioned, and partially because of some disagreements amongst the leadership team about who to ally with and how much we should give and how much we should keep for ourselves. They have a dilemma, right? Because one is we really want to win the 2019 election, but we also want to build the party in the future. So to build the party, you don't necessarily want to give too many seats away to your alliance partners because then you're ceding that territory, right? So they're kind of trapped between these two objectives. The last, I think, reason why the momentum has shifted is the obvious one, which is India-Pakistan. I think Tanvi will probably say more about this in the discussion. I would just say that this is something that the party is exploiting to the hilt, right? Basically saying that for the first time in so many years, India was the victim of a terrorist attack born from Pakistani soil, and we have struck back, right? After years of turning the cheek and then turning the other cheek, we finally had a government with a backbone that decided that they were going to stand up for us. And the Congress is put in a spot because anything they say or do to criticize or raise legitimate questions about how many terrorists did India kill, did we actually hit a training camp, did we shoot down a Pakistani F-16? These are all legitimate questions that one can ask in a democratic society, but they get painted and perceived as being anti-national, right? Essentially undermining the armed forces and questioning the government. And so they have been not so successful in trying to raise those questions and have them sort of play out in the national debate. Okay, so that's a little bit about, I think, where we've been, where we are right now, and now the question is, where are we going? And I'll end here with just three, I think, plausible election scenarios. The first is that the BJP essentially replicates or comes close to replicating its performance from 2014. So it doesn't quite get a single-party majority on its own, but it gets, say, between 250 and 260 seats, which, with its NDA allies, would easily be able to form a government. I think that this is, I'd say, medium probability, so maybe 20, 25%. For this to happen, this favorable hawa would have to continue, right? This India-Pakistan conflict would really have to continue to play out over the next 6 weeks. Remember, voting starts on April 11th, but it doesn't end until May 19th, which is a long time from now. You would have to see some kind of implosion in Uttar Pradesh, which is 80 seats out of the 543, where you have this grand opposition coalition going face-to-face, head-to-head with the BJP. And that the BJP would have to contain some of its losses in the Hindi belt. So some of those projected losses I showed you, maybe they come down because of the Modi factor, right? People voted one way in a state election, but they're going to vote a different way in a national election. So I still think the base case is scenario 2, which is the BJP seats come down considerably, but they are still able to form the government. So in this scenario, they get between, say, 200, 220 seats. With their allies, they get, say, 250 seats or so. And they would need some new partners then to cross the 272 threshold, but I think most people think with these numbers they'd be able to convince a few regional parties to come their way. A couple of options. One is the BJD, the ruling party in Odisha. The other is the YSR Congress Party, which looks to do well in Andhra Pradesh. The ADMK, which is one of the two main Dravidian parties, has already signed up to an expanded NDA. For this to happen, the BJP would do much worse in the Hindi belt, but not suffer catastrophic losses. It would offset some of its losses with gains in the east, particularly in Bengal and Odisha. And that the Grand Alliance in UP, the arithmetic that looks good on paper has not translated into the kind of chemistry in practice. The third scenario, which I think I would give a low probability, is that the BJP seriously underperforms at 2014 and loses about 100 seats. So in this scenario, two things could happen. At 180 or 190 seats, the BJP theoretically could form the government. But to get the number of allies you would need on board, they would ask for a prime minister other than Narendra Modi. Right? So this is the kind of scenario where you get a Nitin Gadkari or Rajnath Patel or someone who's seen as Rajnath Singh, more accommodating. The other option is the BJP decides to sit in opposition and let a Congress-led kind of coalition come to power and then hopefully kind of fall under the weight of its own contradictions, and then the BJP would sort of come in like the knight in shining armor, right? So for that to happen, obviously the Uttar Pradesh would have to go heavily in favor of the Grand Alliance. That the BJP's poor performance would affect not only it, but also many of its coalition allies, and that the opposition somehow manages to execute and put together some of these statewide coalitions that have been late late in the making. So I'll just end there and then look forward to the discussion and the conversation.
Excellent. So thank you, Milan. It was a great presentation and covered a lot of ground. And I think we have ample material here for discussion later. So I want to start with some questions pointed, as I mentioned I would, at each of our panelists and ask them to respond for a few minutes. And perhaps we can have a follow-up to make sure we get into some depth on each of those issues. I want to start with Tanvi and bring up this question of the role to which foreign policy and national security have come in this election. Normally, for those of you who aren't aware, foreign policy and national security issues do not figure importantly in Indian national elections, just as, by the way, they usually do not in American elections. But this time, Pulwama seems to have given the BJP an opportunity to play this outsized role as defender of the nation. I'm sure you're aware that he has appointed himself Chowkidar, or watchman for the nation. And now all of his ministers are Chowkidars, and everybody who's a good Indian is a Chowkidar, right? It's been quite a bit of marketing. So the question is there a there there? Is Pulwama already the terrorist attack on the Indian forces in Kashmir on February 14? Has that already begun to fade in the Indian mind? Is it something, as Neil was saying earlier, that is going to be in the voters' minds as they walk into the booth? Oh, I'm going to vote for my Chowkidar, right? Or are there other more present issues? And can you see any other dimensions to this in terms of national security, foreign policy, and its impact?
I think the correct answer is we don't know. And I think, I think you were exactly right. It's kind of the humility that all of us have to have about this, because we are still debating how some of these issues have played out in previous elections and the impact that they've had. We do know one thing. We know that elections impact foreign and security policy. We've seen it in terms of defense spending, the lack of defense procurement. We've seen it in terms of the lack of economic reform or limited economic reform, particularly on the trade side. We don't have sufficient evidence, despite in the past having had seen some of these events or developments that were kind of foreign and security policy heavy. We haven't quite got enough evidence to suggest that voters in India vote primarily on foreign and security policy. The kind of two most recent examples that we have, one of them is the Kargil War that took place in the summer of '99. In that fall, there were elections, which the BJP ended up winning and won kind of a similar number of seats, but their vote share actually dropped, and they lost a significant number of seats in places like Uttar Pradesh. In the other kind of instance we have is the 2008 Mumbai attacks, where the UPA government led by Manmohan Singh decided not to strike back, as people kind of pejoratively say, showed strategic restraint, which has become a pejorative term, even though it is often seen as a good thing. But in India, it's been portrayed by the BJP as, look, this has been a bad thing, as Milan implied. But nonetheless, even though they did not kind of strike back, the elections, which were about 7 months later, we didn't see, or less around then, we didn't see them kind of lose the election. They in fact won re-election. So that kind of suggests, at least in those elections, that it didn't have that significant impact, though as we say, we don't know, for example, would the BJP have done worse without Kargil in '99, for example. The other thing about those two instances is there was a little bit more space or time between those kind of events and the actual election itself. And in that sense, what the Pulwama attack followed by the Balakot Indian Air Force strike have done is to kind of, as Milan suggested, we don't know how it's going to affect the vote, but it has shifted the narrative, and I think we will find out, and I suspect even on May 24th, we'll be debating how much it affected, it didn't just shift the narrative, but shifted momentum and shifted votes potentially. after, kind of, as Millen mentioned, that after the Congress had made those gains in the state, we saw that kind of momentum, a narrative shift. It was still considered, the election was still considered the BJP's to lose, but it was on the back foot to a certain extent, at least in terms of the narrative that is set, yes, you can say on social media and TV screens, but nonetheless, this thing kind of flows down and down. And the criticism, again, Millen mentioned this, was particularly on the economy, and particularly that the Prime Minister had not delivered on this promise of Achhe Din or good times. Now, what we forget about that Achhe Din promise is there were four main components that were highlighted on Modi's website in 2014. The fourth one was, a part of the Achhe Din was that he would kind of get India respect on the world stage. Now, the Congress would argue that Manmohan Singh was plenty respected all around the world, but the BJP made the case that this restraint, etc., meant that people essentially saw India as weak. And it was kind of part of their promise that they were going to be kind of, the 56-inch chest, the strength on the world stage, kind of a re-emerging power, kind of an old civilization that was essentially recapturing its role in the global stage. And so this is actually, you can also argue that in some ways, because of kind of the Modi foreign policy narrative, is actually his track record, he could argue on that Achhe Din aspect, is perhaps somewhat better than it is on some of the economic aspects. So in that sense, if you look at where this kind of Balakot strike, but also the anti-satellite test, etc., if this is the pitch that the BJP actually prefers to play on. And so this is kind of more comfortable ground for them, even though, as Millen said, credible questions can be asked, and not only about kind of the strikes, the details of the strikes, but also intelligence failures that led to an attack or allowed an attack in the first place, and whether or not the Modi government has spent enough on kind of defense, kind of enhancing defense intelligence capabilities, which many of us have argued they've not spent time on. Nonetheless, as I said, this is comfortable ground for them. As Millen mentioned, they have been using this very actively on the campaign trail, making some claims that even though it is affecting kind of Indian credibility on the global stage, it is potentially kind of working for them, at least in terms of making those claims. The one thing is saying, yes, we struck back. You've heard very kind of active use of the word vengeance, even though the legal position that the Indian government has said this was a self-defense strike. There's no such kind of nuance in terms of those campaign speeches. So when it's kind of nuance, I think this kind of also feeds into that thing of I'm the nationalist leader, and the nationalism, the kind of secular nationalism, even though they've never used the term secular nationalism, but kind of the nationalism that is Indian nationalism also potentially helps them, not just with the strength point, but also potentially if they're concerned about the fracturing of kind of a coalition on the basis of caste, region, language, ethnicity, if you try to get kind of coalesce people around this idea of nationalism, this would help there as well. And then, as I said, this idea of the narrative of strength, of respect, it also feeds into that idea of, we've been debating to some extent, is this a hope election or the fear election? And I think people have essentially settled on 2014 was largely a hope, aspirational election. This is a fear kind of, if not me, what? Election. And this kind of neatly fits into both the hope and fear camp, right? So it's the strength, look, we've shown people that we're strong. But then it also does feed into that fear camp, where you essentially said, and the hope thing is almost trying to recapture what Indira Gandhi had after the 1971 election, the war, where this kind of image of her as some combination of warrior, Durga warrior kind of mode and Wonder Woman all rolled into one. But the fear aspect, which is kind of, essentially suggesting après moi le déluge, that essentially, if it's not me, this is where the Chowkidar thing fits in, which is I am the watchman, I'm the guardian at the gate, and there are barbarians on the other side, whether that's an internal gate or an external gate, regardless, that I am essential to you kind of sticking this through. Now, Rahul Gandhi and I'll kind of end with this, have tried to play on this foreign and security policy ground to some extent, were trying it before the Pulwama attack had ever happened. It is usually not kind of, the incumbents do tend to have the narrative strength on this, have always had the advantage in terms of using these. But Rahul Gandhi has tried to say, for example, listen, and you see it in the Congress manifesto, you haven't spent enough on defense, you haven't spent enough on intelligence capabilities. Now the problem is they can't come up, if you look at what they're doing, we will persuade the UN to kind of list Pakistan or kind of get them to do things. It's not as effective, but you do see them trying to not just say on this, but things like you've been weak on China. And you saw that, and you've seen that even after kind of these attacks. You've been weak on China, you're letting them come in. And what is interesting is, had this not happened, that actually might have stuck. Because, for example, the Prime Minister was in Arunachal Pradesh yesterday giving a speech. If you remember in 2014, he actually went to Arunachal Pradesh and gave a firebrand speech, which was pretty anti-China and I think he actually named it, and essentially said, I don't like countries that encroach on other people's kind of lands and seas. And so I think that could have been a more effective action, and hasn't. We don't know how this will affect votes, but a few things to consider, and I'll end with this, which is just the way this could help is not necessarily actively with somebody going and changing their mind. It could stem the bleeding or stem the anti-incumbency. It could increase turnout for their own base, for example. And finally, Millen's written about this in his Washington Post piece. It could give people who are on the fence a permission slip to say, you know what, Modi might not have delivered on these 5 other things on the economic front, but yes, he's delivered Achhe Din on the foreign policy and national security front.
Great. Thank you. Okay, Nilan, so I'd like you to talk to us a bit about 2 or 3 things, actually. First, there's a language from the past analysis of Indian elections that there were so-called vote banks. Groups, but usually caste, ethno-linguistic groups, sometimes local, regional groups that could be relied upon by the political parties as always to vote for them. And that's been fading in recent years. Yet and in 2014, it seemed like there was a further weakening, a further disattachment. I don't think that's a word, but I'll try it. So my question is are there vote banks anymore? And if so, how much do they matter? I'd like you to also speak a little bit to the issues of corruption and governance, also big issues that Millen has written about extensively. And so we'll get into more of that later, I'm sure. But where are those issues? And finally, urbanization. So Mill and I were discussing this earlier today, or as of today, roughly 35% of India is urban. The projections are, the UN's projections are that by 2050, 50% of the Indian population will live in cities. And that will have a absolutely seismic effect on what goes on in Indian cities and what doesn't go on in Indian cities. And I'm wondering if you can see any importance of that in the way votes going to come out, and how does that play in an election like this?
Okay, started with tough questions for me. So, let me start with the idea of vote bank. I think the way that it's usually been discussed in Indian politics is in terms of a caste or sort of ethnic vote bank. Muslims vote one way, Dalits vote one way, Brahmins vote one way. And I think if we look at the most recent sets of elections, I think the more meaningful variables to understand who's going to win are geography and who you're competing against. So let's sort of take the BJP's victory in 2014. And, Millen talked about 8 states where the BJP won 75% of the vote. I tend to think of 6 states where the BJP won 70% of the vote. It's the same thing, right? And those 6 states are UP, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Maharashtra. In these 6 states, the BJP won 70% of the seats, 69% of the seats, and they won more than 90% of the seats they contested. And so if you remember the map that Millen put up there, that's a large swath of that sort of saffron color where the BJP won its seats. Now if I give you 5 other states in India, I give you, and things may be changing, West Bengal, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh at that time, undivided, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. In these states, of the seats the BJP contested, so not overall vote share, the BJP won 7%. Right? So it tells you just something about the dramatic difference between where the BJP is competitive and where it is not, and where it's winning its seats. And so even this time, I think if you look at the scenarios and if you talk to people within the BJP, they would tell you that we need to hold on to our core geographies if we are to do well in this election. The second thing that I would say, in terms of variables that matter, and this is a larger shift that we're seeing in the Indian party system, is that there are actually two shifts happening at the same time vis-a-vis the BJP and the Congress party. So the first thing is that if we look at 2014 and we look at where the BJP won its seats, when it was a two-party contest between the BJP and the Congress, the BJP won 88% of the time. When it was somebody else the BJP was competing against, it won 49% of the time, basically a point swing. So we're looking at a situation where we used to think in recent times of a bipolar system between the Congress alliance and the BJP alliance, and one of the questions up for debate is, are we shifting to a unipolar sort of, everything is BJP versus the rest, when many years in the past we used to talk about Congress versus the rest. That's something that's open for debate. The second thing that's happening, and that's happened since 2014, is that the BJP is now taking over territory that the Congress used to have in sort of non-Hindi speaking areas. So recently in the state of Tripura, we saw an amazing, sort of increase of about 50 percentage points for the BJP, from less than 2% to, over 50%. And essentially what it did was it completely replaced the Congress party against CPM. They've also talked about breaking into West Bengal and Orissa. So where the Congress party had been the opposition against a regional party actor, now we see the BJP coming into play. That doesn't mean the regional party actors are getting any weaker. In fact, if we look at regional party vote share in 2014, despite BJP's massive victory, it's completely unremarkable. It basically, for the last 20 years, the regional party vote share has hovered within 2 or 3 percentage points of 50%, and in 2014 it was 49%. So we're talking about something that's fairly unremarkable. So I think vote banks in terms of caste and religion, I think it animates us. I think candidates are still chosen that way. I think there are caste matters on the ground, but realistically, people who are running campaigns and people who are thinking about sort of what's going to happen think in terms of geographies and think in terms of who the main competitors are. So now, I want to spend a lot of time on that because the next two questions are really tough. The impact of corruption and governance, and the role that urbanization has to play in the electorate. So look, we have seen the rise of a certain kind of politics that is concerned with the level of corruption on the ground. Most notably associated with the Aam Aadmi Party, with AAP. But it was a large part of the language the BJP used in 2014 to win the election against a corrupt Congress that was falling in on itself, right? And we know that the Congress has perhaps somewhat unsuccessfully, I think Milind can talk more about that, tried to paint the BJP as equally corrupt. So it definitely has entered into our set of political narratives. Now, I think where it becomes challenging is we don't really know what corruption means to the voter. My own sense, and this is completely conjecture, is that grand corruption, while it animates media, is not what animates the voter. Local corruption is what frustrates the voter. So if we were to take the most recent elections in Madhya Pradesh, and this is something that, for those of us who were working on the ground, we saw, if you talk to any political party, not just BJP and Congress, their internal polls have the BJP ahead with a reduced majority, but significantly ahead 4 to 6 weeks before the election. And then you sort of saw the BJP's stock drop like a rock. Some of it had to do with economic difficulties, and some of it had to do with the fact that people were very, very upset with their local politicians. The BJP had been in control for 15 years. Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who had been the chief minister, is still extremely popular and is associated with local development. But the process of doing so created sort of local party mafia dons. And eventually voters got upset. And so I think thinking about corruption, I think we have to sort of go a bit further, and it's actually quite difficult, but we have to sort of associate political parties with the kinds of corruption structures that they sort of are associated with. And with the Congress Party, this is beyond the scope of this discussion, but for those of us who have been steeped in this literature, we know there's a long literature on the Congress Party system which associates local corruption with the Congress Party. And I think it's one of the hidden variables we don't talk enough about. With respect to urbanization, I think the most obvious effect are the kinds of dynamics that Milan was talking about here, where essentially every government in India has been stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to inflation versus keeping farmers happy. If you really are aggressive on inflation targeting and trying to keep inflation down, given the architecture of the Indian economy, you're putting the farmers in a very, very tough position. Farmers cannot, as we had a recent speaker here talk about, Ashok Gulati, farmers cannot easily export their crops in India. And so essentially, inflation targeting involves allowing foreign actors to flood the market, flood the Indian market and keep prices down, really at a cost to the farmers. So I do think that urbanization will change the set of issues that are at play. I think that one of the things that is deeply impactful in urban politics, and we don't see as much in rural politics, is the role that a certain set of public goods play. So if we think about the way that Aam Aadmi Party has been able to sort of build a base in Delhi, it has done so with promises about water, electricity. They're extremely popular in the slums of Delhi. They have done very well with public schools and public health clinics. It's not clear what they're doing with a certain class of middle-class voters who have essentially opted out of everything public and are now sort of engaged in the private system in general. But I do think that you do see a certain set of demands on public goods vis-a-vis, let's say, price targeting, income transfers, which I think we associate much more with rural politics.
Great. Okay, Milan, so there's a lot coming back at you here, but let me make it a little more complicated. So I want you to dig deeper on the economy, because this is a little puzzling to me, because you tick off the bad things that have gone badly in the economy since 2014. There's more than the fingers on one hand. First of all, he said he was going to deliver 10,000 jobs a year. He's hardly gotten to 10 million jobs a year. He's hardly gotten to a million and a half in 4.5 years. The jobs just aren't there. The trend line of growth over this period is actually down. It's not down substantially with all the variations along the trend line. We've seen dropping growth recently in manufacturing growth. They're touting 7%, 7+%, but most economists say that the real rate of growth is somewhere between 5 and 6, because the government fooled with the numbers a few years back to make them look more powerful. And most recently, of course, there's the agrarian distress, which clearly played a role in MP and in Madhya Pradesh. So implicitly, I'm thinking that all of us ought to have been discounting what's the economy stupid, if you will. Tell us more.
Okay. So, I think there's lots of places to start. So there has traditionally been a narrative that good economics doesn't make for good politics in India. That if you look over the vast stretch of post-independence history, there's not much of a correlation between a government's economic performance, either at the central or the state level, and electoral returns. I think what some research that I've contributed to and others have shown is that that's actually changing, that around the year 2000, you start to see increasing electoral returns to governments that are able to generate more growth. And part of the reason for that may be that, this was the period when Indians were first taste the fruits of rapid growth, right? And so the expectations that they set for their governments became much higher, right? So the revolution of rising aspirations, expectations, people talked a lot about that. So if this were an election about the fundamentals, right, one would think that the incumbent would be on the ropes because number one, you had the short-term and costs imposed by a very complicated goods and services tax. Number two, let's not forget demonetization, right, which was this massive exogenous shock, which shaved off, 2 percentage points of GDP, right? A jobs issue where it's a structural issue. It's an issue that's been there even before Modi came to power, but regardless, he hasn't done much to change it. And then you have the agrarian issue, right, which again, you could say, well, a lot of factors, some are exogenous, some have to do with inflation targeting, some have to do with bad monsoons, but whatever, he's the one who's there. So I think that in most parts of the country, people have this list of economic grievances, but they don't necessarily blame Mr. Modi. And I think that the dirty secret here is that a lot of people, particularly in North India, like him. They believe that he's a strong leader, they believe that he's incorruptible, and they believe that he operates with the best interests of the country at heart. And so under that scenario, they're willing to give him, cut him quite a lot of slack, saying, number one, okay, a lot of things have gone wrong, but it's not necessarily his fault, right? Yes, he did demonetization and we got hurt, but he was trying to do the right thing. He was stymied by the people who, gamed the system. I think the way to think about the most recent conflict between India and Pakistan, and Tanvi referenced this, is I think, what it does is people line up their grievances, but they say, well, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, right? And this is something that might just nudge me enough to kind of pull the lever for him again, even though I have some kind of buyer's remorse. So that's my assessment, I think, of where things are. Of course, it could be totally off base, right? I mean, we've been surprised before with, election outcomes we didn't see. But my sense is that it's not hurting him as much as it would have hurt other incumbents because of this charismatic leadership and that people are willing to give him a rather long leash and say, look, his pitch is, you're asking me to undo 65 years of history in 5 years. I can't do it. And from the beginning, he has never been one to say, look, I have a 100-day vision, I have a 5-year vision, right? All of the targets he set for his government, you'll note, expire in 2022 or 2024, right? And so what his objective is not to compare his 5-year tenure with the promises in 2014. It's to compare his tenure with the second term of the UPA government, saying, do you want slow growth, nasty inflation, and corruption headlines every day? Then vote for the other guys. If you want to change, vote for me. He doesn't have as much change to point to, but he's pointing to, give me another 5 years.
Okay, I have another conundrum in my head, and that is, what happened to Hindu nationalism? I know you've been working on it recently. And
hasn't gone anywhere. Right?
I remember 2 years ago, maybe after the demonetization's failure, there was a lot of speculation on, this means that in 2019 he'll run on a more aggressively Hindu nationalist position because that's all he's got going for him now. One could say what's happened economically since is even more of a reason to do that. Now, you could say also that, as Tanvi says, that the strong national leader picture that he's playing out on after Fulwama is an aspect of that. But I haven't seen a lot of discourse, about Ayodhya and building the Ram temple. I haven't seen promises made there. I haven't seen other discourse around more obviously Hindu nationalist themes. And why is that?
Well, I think there's two reasons I would submit. One is that Modi and Amit Shah feel, I think, that they don't have to prove their Hindu nationalist bona fides to anybody. I mean, you just sort of look at their past and look at their associations and let that do the work. That's number one. Mm-hmm. And number two is, Modi is a pragmatic enough politician to have not touched some of the cornerstones of the BJP's social agenda in his first 5 years. So he has not really gone anywhere near Ram Temple. He has not really raised the issue of changing the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir. And he's not really talked about a uniform civil code and getting rid of a separate Muslim personal law. What he has done instead is to create space, particularly at the subnational and local level, for Hindu nationalism to do its work. Mm-hmm. So there we see the rewriting of textbooks to eliminate any mention of Islamic contribution to Indian society. We see not just the banning of cow slaughter, the banning of beef consumption itself in certain states. We see the renaming of place names, right? Allahabad is not Allahabad anymore for a reason. And so I think, just as with 2014, they are using Hindu nationalism in a very targeted manner. Go and see what Mr. Modi and Yogi Adityanath are saying in Western UP. It's full of Hindu nationalist content. Go and see what they're saying in border districts in Bengal and Assam. But in the national theater of politics, that's not been highlighted because they're going on different issues. And this is where the security issue, I think, really helps them because it gives them an alternate narrative other than the economy. I would just say one thing that I find particularly notable, and Neil and I were talking about this yesterday, is one issue that you don't hear at all about in these elections is secularism. Nobody is going to these elections fighting on the backs of secularism, which tells you something about what that word means now, right? I think for a lot of Indians, that word is now coterminous with minority appeasement. And it's a four-letter word, and even the Congress, which was the champion of national secularism, doesn't talk about it anymore. In fact, what the Congress is saying is, we want to reclaim Hinduism from Hindutva, right? We want to show that we're not anti-Hindu. In fact, we're very much pro-Hindu, but we stand for a different kind of Hinduism. So I think that raises big questions about whoever wins in 2019. Is this idea of Nehruvian secularism that India has clung on to that had this famed kind of unity and diversity, is anyone going to try to reconstruct that? Or do we essentially concede a lot of territory and say that Hinduism is essentially going to be sort of first among equals? And we can have a debate about whether we're going to go to the extreme right or the sort of center right, but that's where the debate will take place. I think that's an open question.
Okay, I'd like to pose a couple of questions to the three of you and ask you each briefly to give us your thoughts on. And the first one picks up on both your recent comments and others, and that is India on the path to strongman leadership? In Allah, Orban, in Hungary, Allah, the situation in Turkey, most recently set back to the president. In the United States, for that matter, a kind of populist, nationalist, essentialist view that we have to come back to the core values of our society, of our nation, and that appeals to a wide group of the electorate in essentially a kind of hyper-nationalist fashion, but based on strongman leadership. Let me start with you, Neil, and this quickly across the three of you, if I might.
So I think we are seeing the emergence of a certain kind of strongman leadership in India, but I wouldn't trace the roots necessarily to what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, that is, of course, something that we're all facing, and we see certain types of tactics on Twitter, let's say, that are common across space. But this is a charismatic politics that in some sense is percolated up from the bottom. If we look at states, we can think of a lot of charismatic politicians. It's been going on for a while, and the percentage of charismatic politicians ruling states seems to be going up, whether we talk about Mamta or Mayawati, Mulayam, Lalu. So we've been seeing it since the 90s, right? And what has kept sort of a single charismatic leader from jumping to the top is precisely coalition politics, the fact that somebody has to be able to negotiate across space, across parties. And for whatever reason, and there are a number of reasons, and we've talked about them, 2014 was a moment where a single party could get a majority of the electorate, majority of the seats, not a majority of the electorate, behind itself, and therefore use presidential-style politics to play a sort of single-party form of government, which is not something that we've seen in India for a very, very long time. What I would submit, though, is that while it lasted, you did have Modi behaving as a strong man. You do have a situation where many institutions in India are under threat, and I don't think there's any point in sort of being around the bush about that. But what happens if we take Milan's most likely scenario? Let's take a situation where the BJP wins 200 to 220 seats and relies on alliance partners to form government. Many of the most aggressive decisions we associate with Modi are no longer possible. Demonetization, where only 5 people know and you don't consult with anyone else, is no longer possible because your alliance partners will pull up the next day. Right? Even some of these military actions, I think there's a question about what alliance partners will do in that situation, but certainly the ease of making decisions without consulting other political actors goes way down if you're an alliance. And so we've always had this kind of sort of cooling system in the or at least in recent vintage in India when people sort of get a little too big for their britches, right? And you wonder if that's something that would happen again in 2019, even if the BJP comes back.
I mean, in some ways, Modi is not a lagging indicator. He was the leading indicator of the strongman. This thing, 2014, he precedes Trump. He precedes maybe not Erdogan, but a number of other leaders. So much so that Steve Bannon in 2014 said that he should be the model for the West in terms of how to run and kind of win these elections and kind of how to win in kind of these democratic societies. But I think I think there is this point of this is partly why I think this election is so interesting, because it will tell us that was 2014 just a moment or the beginning of a trend. I think we don't know yet, but I think if any sort of coalition, it will require, and Modi at the end of the day is adaptable. Power in some ways is his ideology more so than anything else. And so the question is, he's going to have to, if there's a coalition, not just do everything that he's never had to run a coalition before. Mm-hmm. He's essentially undercut a lot of his own party members, both at the state level and the kind of central level, in a very Indira Gandhi style. She never, after her initial years, she didn't have to run coalitions in kind of the 80s or kind of so I think there will have to be, if there is a substantial, there are a few people and they're, happily kind of persuaded to come on board and given enough, I think that will be different. But I think we will know whether kind of this is sustainable in India, where yes, we've always had characters, right? Big characters, strong leaders, Mrs. Gandhi herself, but even there were a different kind of strong man of a different nature. But nonetheless, we've had big, towering personalities. The question is that even sustainable beyond kind of the one election?
I don't really have much to add. I agree with everything. I'll just give two quick anecdotes. One is that, among the names Neelan didn't mention is Arvind Kejriwal. Arvind Kejriwal came to power as practicing a very different politics. He, too, has become atop a party that revolves around a single charismatic leader. What was the first thing he did when he came to power? The internal opposition to him managed to be kicked out, right, within a matter of weeks. So it's very, very hard across the political spectrum, it seems, to build a political movement that doesn't rely on this kind of single charismatic figure. The second is I think the BJP is doing an effective job right now, and whether the voters are buying it, I don't know, but at least the salesmanship is such that of putting the fear of God into people about coalition governments. The truth is, and the academic research supports this, that coalitions have been pretty good for India. And you could argue actually their growth record has been even better, particularly when you have either one of the two national parties at the top. Be a part of it, so they have some skin in the game. And so I think, if Modi were to come back in a coalition, one silver lining could be that on some of the majoritarianism would be curtailed because that would be the price coalition allies would demand. But on the economy, it's probably not going to do anything. It's probably not going to change very much because Modi's not going to ally himself with the communists. So the kinds of people he would ally himself with are broadly supportive of the general incrementalist reformist path that he's cut out for himself right now.
So if you were to think of your option 2, your scenario 2. That's what I call the chastened Modi scenario. But the question is, will he really be chastened? Will he be able to run a coalition? Will he be smart enough in the way he deals with his allies to keep them from bolting the first time something bad happens, right?
I mean, I'd say something that we don't talk about in the media, which is it looks like in recent times, in the last 6 months, the allies have gotten better of it, right? I mean, if we are to take Bihar is an amazing case, right? The BJP won 22 states, but it was so worried about its position and so wanted
22 seats.
22 seats, sorry, not 22 seats. It's so worried about its position, it's only contesting 17 this time, and has ceded 17 to a new alliance partner, JDU. You see a similar sort of bargaining tactic with the Shiv Sena, Apna Dal. Who is Apna Dal, right? It's like my team, your team, but they were very successfully negotiated with the BJP to get their seats, right? So interestingly, despite the popular image of who Modi is and who Amit Shah are, they haven't been particularly good at negotiating bargains for the BJP against alliance partners.
Well, I guess to me that sounds like a chastened Modi will also be a less ambitious Modi. And so our hopes for a second round of structural reforms in the Indian economy, for instance.
Having said that, I mean, you could see, especially if he has a bunch of southern coalition partners, whose economies have, yes, they have welfare programs as well, but most of them are kind of far more open in terms of investment, etc., want to attract investment. At the end of the day, these next 5 years, somebody will have to answer the questions, how are you going to pay for all these welfare programs if you're not getting that kind of growth, bringing that investment in? So you could see some of these southern states, so I think it depends on who the coalition partners are. You could see them saying that, listen, on this kind of stuff, if he really decides he wants to do it, they might not slow him down.
I mean, inherent in your question, Marshall, is the presumption that he wants to do major structural reform, and I think that's the question.
Well, hope springs eternal. All right, over to you all. So I'm going to recognize you. Please identify yourself. Please make it a question, or a brief one, please. And if you wish to tag one of the panelists, otherwise let them decide amongst themselves what they want to say. Lisa.
Mitchell from South Asia Studies. I'll make it very brief. What role is social media going to play in this election?
And I should have said wait for the mic.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
What role is social media going to play in this election?
The mic is not working, so.
Neelan, that's you. You're
Who are the Twitter stars?
No, but you're the one who's... Neelan's actually doing research on this very question.
So, I'll just give my sort of nutshell view of how I see social media. I think communication through media has been, it is something that we've studied in politics for a very long time. We have new forms of communication like WhatsApp and Facebook. I'll just start with this sort of simple thing. I was talking to a BJP operative who said, it's very funny that people keep on complaining about Facebook to us because we think Facebook is dead. We've well moved past that, right? But
WhatsApp is not.
WhatsApp is certainly not, right? What has changed in terms of the type of media that we have is that, first of all, the proportion of information that is being conveyed through images and video has certainly increased. And the life cycle has decreased, right? So when we used to talk about things going viral, we would talk about something being on YouTube for a month or 2 months. I mean, something on a WhatsApp chain is lasting for 24 hours and then moving on. What it means is it's extremely hard to counteract messages that are disappearing after 24 hours and 48 hours. Now, the other major point I'd make about this kind of media strategy is that people tend to think that social media is somehow a counterweight to traditional political organization, but actually it's the opposite. It's synergistic. So what is the BJP IT team doing? They're not the MIT computer science department. What they're doing is they are beaming a message to a dedicated set of political polling booth workers who then do the last mile and communicate it to voters, mobilize voters, figure out who to get the information to. So interestingly, despite us sort of talking about media as this sort of big bad thing, what it essentially has done is it has been able to create a uniform message, I think, within political parties to be able to reach the last sort of the ground level actor with a certain uniform message, which wasn't as plausible before, and has perhaps increased the efficiency of these ground-level political actors because of the information that they're armed with.
I think there is, though, that destructive impact that we've seen around the world, where there is a polarizing effect because you do get into also echo chambers, where you're talking to the people or listening to the people that you follow, and also kind of attacking people or their bona fides or their motivations. We're seeing that as well. But I think there is that positive side, which is in some ways it's become a more democratic conversation. People are debating issues. And the parties have had to up their game, making very complex, sometimes policy issues, much more translatable. I was looking at the Congress Party manifesto. If nothing else, just the design of it and how, if you read old manifestos, they were kind of complex, the language was jargony. This is just simple, conveyed in both the Hindi and English versions. Very simple language, and I think that is partly because of realizing that things need to be tweetable or WhatsAppable, I guess.
No, that was for Rahul Gandhi's understanding.
Yes. This gentleman here, please. Next to please.
Thank you. Ram Rao, historian, University of Delaware. So I have a question to all of three of you, and I want to kind of focus on the rural area, and so both in terms of attack, the terrorist attack, but also the remarkable suffering that's going on in the countryside because of the reforms. And I mean, what happened in central India, Madhya Pradesh, and other places, and also the alliance in between, which may actually spring a remarkable surprise and do you want to unpack more? Because I'm not sure how much. So I have two kind of related questions. One is I'm not sure how much impact the terrorist attack will have among voters outside the urban constituencies. And even there, I'm not sure. And the second thing, I think the farm economy is going to play a really important role. And if you want to unpack how this, the conditions of farmers and the alliance that is shaping up in UP, how that going to that may have some potential to challenge BJP.
Okay, let's focus on the rural farm economy issue for this purpose. Hello?
I mean, I mean, I think, Ram, it's a great question. I can't pretend to be an expert on the subject. What I would say is that, number one, the ruling party is highly aware and afraid of this issue because going back to the Gujarat Assembly elections, and Neelan has done work on this, if you look at where the Congress made big gains in Gujarat, it was particularly in rural areas where farmer issues were the most acute. Even in the Hindi Belt elections, again, going back to something Neelan has shown, is that in areas where you see a larger share of voters who either directly or indirectly work with agriculture is where the BJP suffered big losses. I think their hope is that they are partially going to neutralize some of these issues with this PM Kisan program, right, which is this guaranteed 6,000 rupee payment to small farmers around the country as a sort of, down payment as a way to alleviate rural stress. One question I have about this program is how they're actually doing this, given that the status of land records in most parts of India, particularly North India, are not that great. I think they're actually just sort of throwing money around. And in fact, there was a story in the Hindi press a couple of weeks ago that said there were farmers in eastern UP who were getting money in their bank accounts, and 24 hours later the money was being taken out of their bank accounts. So, sort of what's going on there. The Congress obviously is coming to this with this big scheme of the 72,000 rupees. I think they have two problems in trying to take back the narrative. The first is that, ironically, Rahul Gandhi and the Congress could be victim from Modi's failure. So Modi in 2014 said 15 lakhs are going to go to every household. I'm going to reclaim all the black money that's being stashed in Swiss bank accounts and send it around. Obviously, we know that didn't happen. And so I think some people look at what Rahul Gandhi said and say it's another jumla, right? It's another election gimmick. These guys promised 15 lakhs. These guys are promising 72,000 rupees. The second problem is I think the Congress has erred in not keeping their eye on the ball with respect to the economy. I think I could be wrong, but my sense is that harping on the Rafale fighter jet scam issue was a mistake for two reasons. One is that it's an incredibly difficult scandal to explain to ordinary voters. I mean, the three of us here, if you asked me to tell you about it in 15 seconds, I couldn't do it. And the second is, it goes back to something I said earlier, I don't think a lot of Indians are willing to believe that Modi personally is on the take, that he somehow designed this thing to give to Anil Ambani. And so as a result, I think had the Congress instead been focused on this rural narrative for the past 1 year, going hammer and tongs, it would have been a different outcome, but that's my...
I'll just make a 5-second interjection
Sure.
here. I think political analysts continually mess up predicting what's happening in the rural countryside because they assume that every farmer is the same, right? And I think you know very well that one of the most important variables is landedness and landlessness and caste, right? And one of the traditional problems, for instance, a farm loan waiver only goes to actually a certain subset of the population.
Only those who have official credit.
Exactly. So when we sort of think about rural distress and some of the issues that actually the BJP has created vis-a-vis caste because of the sort of aforementioned quota system that Milind talked about, there are certain states where the BJP internally is quite worried, like Maharashtra, where there seems to be both rural distress and increasing caste division, right? And so these are variables that they're moving very fast, they're very hard to pick up. And they're the things that we don't really know about, right? I mean, those are the kinds of states that can really spring surprises.
And this scheme that the government announced in the budget of the 6,000 rupees is a joke.
Well, farmers are laughing at it.
Yeah, it's at somewhere between 3 and 6% of their annual income, and these are farmers without a lot of annual income, by the way. But it's a joke, and I don't think it's going to be taken seriously anywhere. I mean, they're too savvy to think that it's necessarily a down payment on something later. So I tend to discount that heavily. Well, I've got several here. Can I do this, because our time is now coming to a close? Can I ask each of you quickly to a question, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do rapid-fire responses to all of you. Let me start with Vijay.
My question is very simple. All this intellectual discussion aside, how big is the TINA factor?
There is no alternative, the TINA factor. Okay. Do you want to take 3 questions, or just do
Yeah,
one by
sorry,
one?
let's just take the 3, yeah.
Yeah, I just really still from political science. I wanted to go back to the strongman image vis-a-vis China. If you think about geopolitical influence, China is doing this massive project, Belt and Road Initiative. India's left out of it. Everyone else is being brought in. You've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization going on. Is there any conversation among anyone in the electoral context about how Modi looks vis-a-vis Xi? Xi looks like a serious strongman. When we talk about Modi as a strongman, I can imagine Xi kind of smiling a little bit. I mean, he is doing everything around India, going around, setting up ports, connections, bases.
Yeah.
This is yours, definitely. And over here, please, Maya. Yeah. And that'll be it. Thank you.
Hi, this is Vibhu. There's a quick question on the style of elections. So after 2014, it has been mostly presidential.
Can you put the mic a little closer to your mouth, please?
So after 2014,
I think it went off.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Yes, fine.
So it has been mostly presidential form of an election till I think last 3 assembly elections, if we discount that. And Modi enjoys a pretty high rating, popularity rating vis-a-vis their competitors amongst in general public and especially among the young voters, which is supported by the recent surveys of 65% and 56%. So how much do you think is that going to be a factor in the election?
Okay. Tavi, you want to go first on the...
Sure.
I'll take the last one.
I think on the China question, I mean, you have seen, and I think I didn't mention, in his speech yesterday in Arunachal, he did not mention China, unlike his speech in 2014. And I think part of that is when you're a prime minister and you're actually trying to he's part of the reason of having a somewhat stabilized relationship with China in the last years. You actually don't, either with Pakistan or China, want to pick a fight in an election year, because crises are not things you can control, and no smart politician wants to actually have a crisis out of control close to an election, particularly one with somebody like China who is larger and who has more strength. Having said that, we've now actually seen the second phase of Belt and Road, where there's actually a lot of pushback from various countries around the world, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Zambia, whether it's even Pakistan, where there's serious pushback about what the Chinese are doing, what the impact of Belt and Road. India is actually now looking that it had foresight. Now that doesn't mean India's not taking investment from. India will take investment from China, just not Belt and Road, because India cannot join Belt and Road, because it would mean accepting that Kashmir is essentially, or the parts of Kashmir that Pakistan holds, is essentially Pakistani, because that's where some of the projects are. So it cannot be part of it. But I think one thing, we don't know what's going on. We see the chaos in India, because it's a democracy. So, yes, Modi looks like we don't know what's happening in China. Or we know to some extent. We do know what's happening in Xinjiang. So I don't know if he'll be smiling. He might be, he's got pushback amongst his own kind of colleagues as well. So you have to have a very different kind of leadership where, the question for the Communist Party is, they don't have to worry about the legitimacy. Sure, Modi doesn't deliver, his government falls. In China, the government doesn't deliver, the whole system could collapse. So I don't know, I'd still vote for rather having a kind of democratic India with kind of, whoever at the realm, then be in Xi's position, no matter how good it looks from the outside. I'll just say one thing about kind of the historian in me is pained to point out that this kind of presidential style election is not new. You recall the phrase, India is Indira and Indira is India, and those kinds of things. We've seen this, in fact, more often than not. But at the end of the day, it does come back to a very parliamentary, no matter how presidential, might be a personality-based election. But every seat, and this is where parliamentary system, I think, is different. You still have to do it in terms of coalitions or seat share, or vote share and seats at the end of the day, which is not going to be true in a presidential system.
Tina?
Yeah, I think the Tina factor is absolutely right. I think that's what Modi has gone to the bank on, saying, we're coming out, and we were very transparent in 2014, and we're once again transparent, saying, I'm going to lead this government if you bring the BJP NDA to power. And who does the other side have? On Monday they'll tell you it's Rahul. On Tuesday they'll say it's Mayawati. On Wednesday they'll say it's Akhilesh. On Thursday it's Sharad Pawar. And he goes on like that. And I think that does have an impact, because the survey data that we have from several elections suggests that the identity of the prime minister does have a significant bearing. Now the objective of the opposition is to make this a 29-state election and to say this isn't a single national election, that if you're a villager in Tamil Nadu, Modi's not going to do anything for you, right? That has to be dealt with locally, same in Odisha, same in UP. But I think part of the struggle is getting these coalition partners together on the same page in time, and I think they're saving it quite late.
So just very quickly on the sort of presidential style politics vis-a-vis sort of what we might think of as state politics, and I'll also mention Tina quickly as well. I think there's a way of thinking about politics now because of Modi that national politics has nothing to do with state politics and there's no relationship. Actually, empirically, nothing could be further from the truth, right? And state elections and how at the constituency level, how a party does is actually highly predictable of how it does, even in 2015. The way to think about this is imagine that there are two constituencies, constituency A and constituency B. Constituency A has more BJP supporters than constituency B. That constituency will do better for the BJP in A, will do better than B in both the state and the national election. So the way that you sort of think about what the Modi effect might be is it adds some vote share to each of these constituencies beyond what the underlying constituency level factors might be. And so when people are predicting elections, so what goes into all of these scenarios is essentially to say, we start with the constituency level map and what are the constituency level factors, and then how much are we adding for Modi or subtracting for Modi or whatever, right? In 2014, we believe the Modi effect was around 10 percentage points, right? So if that number drops to 6 or 7, we're looking at kind of the most popular scenario, the high probability scenario. If that number drops below 5%, the BJP is probably not in trouble, right? Given the most recent state elections. And that's the thing that we don't know. Just to end with Tina, I mean, I think this is actually the larger question of the shift that we're seeing in the Indian party system. The Congress Party is not doing well against the BJP. It has to do with the fact that it's losing on national narrative, and also it has a weaker party organization. That's not true with regional parties, and you see the BJP's performance against regional parties is actually quite pedestrian. And these are factors that are going to play quite seriously in 2019.
Okay, I have to finally ask this, and I'm going to ask you to give me a yes or no answer, each of you. If scenario 1 comes to pass, or scenario 1A, which I would say is an even stronger performance for the BJP, but not scenario 1, is that the end of the Congress Party as a national party?
No.
No, that's funny.
Okay. And is it the end of the Gandhi family leadership of the Congress Party?
No.
No.
Thank you, everybody. Please join me in thanking them.